Thomas Dewey had 47 investigators, 18 months of evidence, and the full weight of New York law. Stephanie St. Clair had a fountain pen and one sheet of paper. He never considered which was more dangerous. The memo was 3 pages long, single-spaced, no letterhead, no signature, just names, dates, and wire surveillance logs running 9 months deep. It arrived on Stephanie St. Clair's desk on a Tuesday morning in October 1937, slid beneath her door before dawn by a hand she had never seen and never asked to see. That was the arrangement. You didn't ask who. You asked what. She read it twice. Once quickly. Once slowly. Then she set it face down on the mahogany surface and looked out the window of her 4th-floor apartment at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, where the morning light was pressing through the trees of Sugar Hill in long, pale strips. The memo concerned Thomas E. Dewey. By October 1937, Thomas Dewey needed no introduction in New York. He was 35 years old, broad-shouldered, relentlessly precise, the kind of man who wore ambition the way other men wore cologne. 2 years earlier he had prosecuted Lucky Luciano, the most powerful organized crime figure in America, and put him behind bars for 30 to 50 years. The city gave Dewey a ticker-tape parade. The newspapers called him a crusader. He was already thinking about the governor's mansion in Albany, and everyone in New York law enforcement knew it. What men like Thomas Dewey always needed next was a larger trophy. Now he was looking at Harlem. The investigation had begun quietly, the way Dewey's campaigns always began. Not with warrants and raids but with paperwork. Ledgers. Bank records. A phone tap here, a cooperative witness there. 47 investigators assigned exclusively to the Harlem numbers racket, working in rotating shifts from a secured office on the 9th floor of 60 Center Street in Lower Manhattan. 18 months of groundwork laid in deliberate silence. A grand jury already convened in secret. And at the center of it all, her name. Stephanie St. Clair. Primary target. She read those 3 words again, though the memo remained face down on her desk. She didn't need to look at it. Dewey's reasoning was not difficult to reconstruct. The Harlem numbers racket moved an estimated $3 million a year through Lenox Avenue, 7th Avenue, and every block in between. That was the public number. The real number was closer to 5 million. To a prosecutor building a career on headlines, dismantling Harlem's numbers empire was worth more than Lucky Luciano. It was bigger. It was messier. And it was Harlem, which meant it was black. Which meant, in the courtrooms of 1937, the defense bar started 3 steps behind the moment the case was filed. That was the calculation. It had always been the calculation. Stephanie rose and moved to the window. Below on Edgecombe Avenue, the morning was beginning its ordinary business. A fruit vendor arranged his cart on the corner. A woman in a blue coat walked her child toward school. 2 men in work clothes turned toward 155th Street and disappeared. Harlem on a Tuesday morning. Going about its life. Unaware. She had built something here. Not just an empire, something more durable than that. A network of trust, obligation, and mutual survival, stitched into the fabric of this neighborhood over 15 years. One number slip at a time. One rent envelope at a time. One family protected at a time. Dewey's machine was built to dismantle it. He had 47 investigators. He had a grand jury. He had the full authority of the state of New York and the considerable weight of his own ambition behind every subpoena he signed. Stephanie walked back to her desk. She turned the memo face up and read it a 3rd time, slowly, methodically, the way she read everything that mattered. Not searching for threats. Searching for gaps. Every investigation had gaps. Every prosecutor had a blind spot. Thomas Dewey, for all his crusader's brilliance, had made the same mistake every man before him had made. He had spent 18 months studying what Stephanie St. Clair did. He had not spent a single hour considering how she thought. She pulled open the top drawer of her desk. She removed a fresh sheet of paper and uncapped her fountain pen. She began to write. She had not arrived in Harlem asking for permission. That was the first thing you needed to understand about Stephanie St. Clair. In 1912, the year she stepped off a steamship at the port of New York, Harlem was in the middle of its great transformation. A neighborhood that had been German, then Jewish, now filling steadily with black families arriving from the American South and the Caribbean islands, streaming into a city that tolerated their presence and used their labor while making clear, in 100 daily ways, that their lives were worth considerably less than other lives. Stephanie had seen that particular arithmetic before. She was born in 1886 on the island of Martinique, a French Caribbean colony where the distance between the colonizers' houses and the Black Quarter was measured not in blocks but in centuries of enforced silence. Her mother had worked with her hands. Her father, by most accounts, was absent. What Martinique gave Stephanie St. Clair was not comfort or privilege. It gave her observation. It gave her patience. And it gave her a very clear understanding of how power worked in a world that had been arranged to exclude her from it. The crossing from Martinique to New York took 11 days. She spent most of them watching the water change from Caribbean blue to Atlantic gray, planning in the careful, quiet way she planned everything. She was 26 years old, traveling alone, with $200 pinned to the inside of her coat and a capacity for patience that her enemies would later mistake for hesitation. It was never hesitation. She arrived in Harlem with those $200, no connections and fluency in French, a language that impressed no one on Lenox Avenue. What she had instead, a mind that processed systems. In the early years she learned the city the way only immigrants learn cities, completely, obsessively, without the luxury of taking anything for granted. She learned which precincts were venal and which were merely indifferent. She learned which landlords could be reasoned with and which needed pressure. She learned which newspapers shaped Black Harlem's opinion of itself, and which white newspapers shaped the opinion of the courts and the city hall clerks and the prosecutors who would matter later. She learned the numbers. The numbers game, what Harlem called the policy racket, was, at its core, elegant in its simplicity. Players chose a 3-digit combination and bet as little as a penny each day. When the winning number was drawn, calculated from published financial data, untouchable by the House, the payout was 600 to 1. For the families of Harlem, where a domestic worker earned $8 a week and a factory laborer often earned less, it was the most democratic form of hope available. In a city that locked black men and women out of banks, out of unions, out of every formal mechanism for building wealth, the numbers was something else entirely. A parallel economy built by and for the community, and considerably more reliable than most legitimate institutions of the era. For the woman who ran it, who employed the runners and the bankers and the collectors, who understood every layer of it from street corner to ledger, it was an empire. Stephanie St. Clair understood this by 1920. By 1923 she was running it. She started with one territory, a 6-block radius on the west side of Lenox Avenue, and she built outward from there with the same methodical patience she brought to everything. She hired runners who were trustworthy, not just fast. She paid them fairly, which, in a Harlem where white bosses routinely shorted black workers for sport, was itself a form of loyalty building that no amount of threats could replicate. She kept 2 sets of records, one for operations, one for intelligence. The intelligence ledger tracked everything: who owed money to whom, which police officer worked which shift, which judge had debts that needed careful managing, which rival was expanding into her territory and how quickly. By the late 1920s, Stephanie St. Clair's numbers operation moved an estimated $45,000 a week through Upper Manhattan. She employed more than 50 runners. She maintained contacts inside 3 different precincts, 2 newspapers, and the office of at least one city councilman whose name she never mentioned in public. She was, by any fair accounting, one of the most significant economic forces in Depression-era Harlem. She knew it, and she used that knowledge with precision. Every Friday envelopes went out. Families who couldn't make rent. Church collections that needed supplementing. A funeral here. A lawyer's retainer there. Stephanie did not do this for sentiment. She did it because in a neighborhood under constant economic siege, loyalty had to be cultivated the way a farmer cultivates soil, consistently, generously, and with the long term always in mind. The community of Harlem did not simply tolerate Stephanie St. Clair. Protected her. And when the time came, that protection would prove more durable than any hired gun, any bribe, any weapon her enemies could bring to bear. The men who came for her did not understand this. Dutch Schultz came first. In 1931, the Bronx bootlegger who had built his empire on violence and speed turned his attention to Harlem's numbers racket, which was more lucrative than beer and, crucially, still fully operational as Prohibition wound toward its end. He wanted the territory. He sent men to take it. He assumed, the way such men always assumed, that a black woman from the Caribbean would not hold against the kind of force he was prepared to apply. He was wrong. What followed was 4 years of war, not the kind fought with bullets alone, but the kind fought with newspapers and lawyers and informants and patience. Stephanie sued. She testified. She placed paid advertisements in the Amsterdam News naming Schultz's operations and documenting the police officers she could prove were on his payroll. She wrote open letters that Harlem read on street corners and in church pews. She moved money. She moved people. She built a legal record that made every action Schultz took against her twice as expensive for him as it was for her. She survived 3 attempts on her life and lost associates she grieved in private, quietly, completely, and never publicly. That grief was hers alone. It did not slow her. And on October 23, 1935, Dutch Schultz was shot at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, the result of a Mafia Commission vote that Stephanie had reportedly anticipated by 6 weeks. When Schultz died the following day, a telegram arrived at his associate's office. 4 words. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. No one who knew Stephanie St. Clair needed to ask who sent it. By 1937, she was 51 years old, and she had outlasted every man who had moved against her. She had done it not through the application of superior violence, though she was not a woman who frightened easily, and the .32 caliber revolver in her desk drawer had not always stayed there. She had done it through information, through networks, through a community that had decided, collectively and individually, that Stephanie St. Clair was worth protecting. She sat at her desk in the 4th-floor apartment on Edgecombe Avenue, the memo face up in front of her, the fountain pen uncapped and waiting. Outside, Harlem moved through its morning. The fruit vendor had made his first sale. The woman in the blue coat had long since disappeared around the corner. Thomas Dewey believed he was building a case against a numbers queen. He did not know he was building a case against a woman who had been winning exactly this kind of fight for 25 years. Dewey was not the first man to decide that Stephanie St. Clair needed to be stopped. He was simply the latest. The raids began in the spring of 1936. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious even for Dewey. They came in waves, spaced carefully apart, timed to arrive before word could travel from one block to the next. Early morning usually. 4:30, 5 o'clock, when Harlem was still largely asleep and the precincts to the south were staffed by night shifts that owed their overtime to Dewey's office. The first raid hit a number house on West 133rd Street at 4:47 a.m. on March 11. 12 men arrested. Ledgers seized. The operation had been running out of a hat shop, a detail the newspapers found picturesque and reported accordingly. The second raid came 6 days later, a collection point on 7th Avenue near 125th Street. 9 arrests. A third followed on April 2 at an address on 116th Street that Dewey's men had been watching for 4 months. The machine was moving. And it was moving directly towards Stephanie St. Clair. Inside the secured office on the 9th floor of 60 Center Street, Dewey's investigators kept meticulous records. Progress charts. Organizational diagrams. A map of Upper Manhattan with pins marking every known numbers operation, color-coded by status. Red for active, yellow for under surveillance, green for successfully prosecuted. Over the course of 1936, the map grew increasingly green below 110th Street. Above 110th Street, in Harlem itself, the red pins barely moved. The problem was not evidence. Dewey's men had plenty of evidence. Wire surveillance logs. Ledgers seized in raids. Testimony from runners who had been arrested, processed, and then, one by one, gone quiet. The problem was witnesses. Specifically, the sudden and inexplicable inability of anyone in Harlem to remember seeing anything, knowing anything, or being willing to say anything in a grand jury room about the operations of one Stephanie St. Clair. By the autumn of 1936, 3 of Dewey's most promising cooperative witnesses had recanted their testimony. A 4th had moved, quietly, completely, to Philadelphia. A 5th claimed, in a signed affidavit, that she had confused Stephanie St. Clair's operation with a different organization entirely, and was very sorry for the misunderstanding. No one in Dewey's office could understand it. Harlem understood it perfectly. 15 years was a long time. Long enough for Stephanie's runners to have put food on the tables of families up and down Lenox Avenue and 7th Avenue and St. Nicholas Avenue when no white employer would hire the men in those families and no bank would loan them $1. Long enough for her lawyers to have appeared in courtrooms on behalf of residents beaten by police and charged with crimes they hadn't committed. Long enough for her name to mean something specific and unambiguous in every church, every barbershop, every corner of Harlem that mattered. What Thomas Dewey was offering frightened witnesses. A reduced charge, a lenient sentence, the theoretical goodwill of the special prosecutor's office. What Stephanie St. Clair had built over 15 years was something that couldn't be placed on the same scale. It wasn't fear. It wasn't coercion. It was a community that had looked at what she offered, protection, fair dealing, genuine investment in their survival, and made a collective decision that she was worth more to them than any deal Dewey's investigators could put on a table. You could not buy that kind of loyalty. You could only earn it. Dewey's office had not earned it. Bumpy Johnson understood this perhaps better than anyone. In 1936, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of a remarkable calm that those who crossed him consistently mistook for passivity. He had come to work for Stephanie St. Clair in the early 1930s, during the worst of the Dutch-Schultz War, and he had understood from the beginning that the work he did for her was not primarily about force. It was about presence, about being visible in the places where visibility itself was the message. In the weeks following the first raids, Bumpy moved through Harlem quietly and deliberately, not threatening, not intimidating. Asking questions. Tracking which of Stephanie's runners had been picked up, which had been held, which had been approached by Dewey's men with deals. Reporting back to the fourth floor of 409 Edgecombe Avenue with the same steady precision he brought to everything. "They're talking to the same 6 men, he told Stephanie one evening in late April 1936. "Same 6, every time." Nobody knew. Stephanie nodded. She filed the information in the intelligence ledger. The date, the names, the precinct numbers. She did not explain what she intended to do with it yet. But she had begun to notice something. In the months that Dewey's investigation had been pressing against her operation, she had developed a habit, methodical, almost compulsive, of tracking the investigation's movement against everything else she knew about organized gambling in New York. She cross-referenced Dewey's grand jury subpoenas against her own records of other operations. The Italian-run lottery houses in the Bronx, the Irish-controlled numbers operations in Brooklyn, the white-owned policy banks operating out of offices in Lower Manhattan that everyone in city government knew about and no one had troubled to investigate. She began keeping a second ledger. She called it simply the names. The names were of gambling operations that Dewey's office had identified, investigated. She could confirm this from court filings that were technically public record, and then quietly declined to pursue. Operations that had continued running without interruption while Harlem was raided on a quarterly schedule. Operations run by men who were white, who had different lawyers, who lived in different boroughs, and whose prosecutors, it appeared, had different ambitions than those assigned to Upper Manhattan. By the winter of 1936, Stephanie had 17 entries in the second ledger. By the spring of 1937, she had 23. The pattern was not subtle. It was not accidental. It was, in fact, the kind of documented selective prosecution that, if placed before the right newspaper editor in the right format at the right moment, could accomplish something no defense lawyer, no courtroom motion, no amount of money ever could. It could change the story. Not in the grand jury room on the 9th floor of 60 Center Street, where Thomas Dewey controlled every variable and every outcome. In the streets. In the newspapers. In the court of public opinion where Stephanie St. Clair had been fighting, and winning, for 15 years. She looked at the second ledger. 23 entries, each one documented, each one verifiable, each one a small piece of a larger and undeniable truth. She looked at her fountain pen. She began to understand exactly what kind of weapon she was holding. November 1937. The apartment on the 4th floor of 409 Edgecombe Avenue was quiet in the mornings, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Stephanie St. Clair had arranged it that way. No visitors before 9. No runners at the door before she had made her calls, reviewed her ledgers and decided, with the deliberateness she brought to every decision, what the day required of her. The desk was mahogany, wide-surfaced, purchased in 1928 from a furniture maker on Amsterdam Avenue who had charged her twice what he would have charged a white customer and accepted her payment without looking her in the eye. She had never gone back. But she had kept the desk. Was good work. Solid. And it held, on its surface on this particular November morning, everything she needed. 2 ledgers. Her original operations ledger, 12 years of numbers activity, runner networks, collection routes, police contacts, precinct schedules. And beside it the second ledger. The names. She worked with it the way a lawyer works with case law, systematically, without emotion, building an argument from documented facts toward an inevitable conclusion. Every entry she made began with a case number from Dewey's office, cross-referenced against the New York Supreme Court's publicly available docket, then annotated with what had happened. Investigation opened, investigation suspended, case declined, no charges filed. Beside each entry she wrote the background of the operation's owner. Italian, Irish, Jewish, white. Not one prosecution. Not one indictment. Not one name from those operations had appeared in a grand jury room. Meanwhile she counted the raids on Harlem. 12 in 1936. 4 in the first quarter of 1937. Over 200 arrests. Black men and women, most of them runners earning $7 a week, now carrying criminal records that would follow them into every job application, every housing application, every interaction with the system for the rest of their lives. The numbers did not lie. Thomas Dewey was not fighting organized crime. He was fighting black organized crime. The distinction mattered enormously. And Stephanie St. Clair intended to make sure New York knew it. She did not work alone. She never had. The first call she made, carefully from a telephone she kept separate from her business lines, was to the offices of the New York Amsterdam News on 7th Avenue. The Amsterdam News was Harlem's paper of record, read on every block from 110th Street to the Harlem River, trusted in a way that white newspapers never could be in a community that had learned, over generations, not to trust white newspapers. She had placed advertisements there before. She had submitted letters before. She understood its rhythms, its editorial preferences, its readership. She did not call to submit a letter. Not yet. She called to ask one question: whether the paper had received or had knowledge of any documented complaints regarding the selective nature of Dewey's prosecution. The answer, after 2 conversations across 3 days, was yes. The Amsterdam News had a file. Letters from readers. A column draft that had been written but not yet published, held pending further corroboration. Stephanie noted this in the margin of her second ledger. Then she made the second call. The lawyer's name was Arthur Garfield, a civil rights attorney who worked out of a 3-room office on 145th Street, 3 blocks north of the Abyssinian Baptist Church. He had appeared in court on behalf of Harlem residents in 11 separate police brutality cases between 1930 and 1936, winning 7 of them. He was precise, undramatic, and completely reliable, qualities Stephanie valued above all others in anyone she brought into her confidence. She laid the second ledger open on his desk during their meeting in the second week of November. She watched him read it. He read it twice. "This is all documented," he said. "Every entry," Stephanie replied. "Court dockets. Public record. Any reporter in the city can verify it in an afternoon." Garfield looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do with it?" Stephanie closed the ledger. "I'm going to write a letter." Bumpy Johnson came on a Thursday afternoon in late November, his hat in his hand, moving through the door of the Edgecombe Avenue apartment with the deliberate economy of a man who never entered a room without first reading it. He was not there for an operational report. She had already received those. He was there because he had spent 3 weeks moving through Harlem listening, and he had something to tell her that wasn't in any ledger. "People are scared," he said, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Not of you. Of what happens if Dewey wins this one. If you go down, the whole operation goes. The envelopes stop. The protection stops." He paused. "People are asking what they can do." Stephanie was quiet for a moment. Then she pointed to the desk. Bumpy looked at the 2 ledgers spread before her. The second one was open to a page dense with handwritten entries, annotated in the narrow, precise cursive she had been writing in since she taught herself formal French script at the age of 14. He leaned forward. He read 3 entries. Then he sat back. "You're going to burn him with his own record," Bumpy said. It wasn't a question. Stephanie said nothing. She picked up her fountain pen and made a note in the margin of the second ledger. She did not need to confirm what Bumpy Johnson had already understood. That was the arrangement. She planned. He moved. Harlem listened. What she needed from him now was one thing: to ensure that the right people in Harlem, the ministers, the civic leaders, the community figures whose voices carried weight beyond her own, were prepared to speak publicly if called upon. Not to defend her specifically. To speak to the pattern. The raids. The arrests. The selective enforcement that had been hitting Harlem's working people while white-run operations continued undisturbed 4 miles south. "Can you do that?" she asked. Bumpy stood, put his hat back on, and moved toward the door. "Already started," he said. She wrote it across 4 nights in the first week of December 1937. The desk lamp threw a circle of yellow light across the mahogany surface. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing. Harlem settled into its winter, the sound of jazz from Small's Paradise carrying faintly from 135th Street when the wind was right, the occasional rattle of a streetcar on 7th Avenue 3 blocks west, the deep and particular quiet of Sugar Hill at 2 in the morning. Stephanie wrote. The first draft ran 9 pages. She cut it to 7. Then to 5. Then, across the third night, to 3, because 3 pages was what a newspaper could print, what a reader would finish, what an editor would commit to running. Every cut removed emotion. Every revision added precision. She took out the word injustice, too general, too easily dismissed as sentiment. She took out the word racism, not because it was inaccurate but because she wanted no one to be able to dismiss the letter as ideological. She replaced both words with numbers. Case numbers. Dates. Names of operations and their owners. Dollar amounts. Arrest totals. The cold, verifiable language of the public record, which no one could argue with and no one could call a lie. What remained when she was finished was not an argument. Was a record. A clean, irrefutable, publicly verifiable record of what Thomas Dewey's office had done and what it had deliberately declined to do, organized by category, annotated with source citations that any reader could independently confirm, and addressed not to Dewey, not to any court, but to the people of New York City. The letter began. In the interest of public accuracy, the following documented facts are submitted for the consideration of every citizen of this city who believes that the law should apply equally, regardless of the neighborhood in which a person conducts their affairs. It ended. These are not allegations. These are matters of public record. Let the public record speak. She read it through a final time. She did not change a word. She folded it once. Then again. She placed it in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote a single name on the outside. Not a lawyer's name. Not a judge's. Not the name of anyone in any official capacity. The name of a newspaper editor. She set it on the corner of the desk. Then she turned out the lamp and went to bed. The courier came the following morning at 7:15. A young man named Marcus who had been running errands for Stephanie's organization since 1933 and who understood, without being told, that certain deliveries required silence, speed, and no questions. Stephanie handed him the envelope. Amsterdam News, she said. To the editor directly. Not the front desk. Marcus nodded. Today, she said. He was out the door in 40 seconds. Stephanie stood at the window for a long moment, watching the street below. Edgecombe Avenue on a December morning. The fruit vendor's cart was gone, too cold now for outdoor selling. A woman in a heavy coat walked briskly toward the corner. A car moved slowly through the intersection at 155th Street. Somewhere downtown, on the 9th floor of 60 Center Street, Thomas Dewey's investigators were at their desks, working their case, building their case, operating with the complete confidence of men who had never been seriously challenged by anyone they considered a serious opponent. They did not know that the case had already changed. They did not know that the story had already been rewritten. They would find out when everyone else did. In the morning edition. The Amsterdam News hit Harlem at 6:47 in the morning. It came the way it always came, bundled in stacks of 40, dropped from the back of a delivery truck at the corner of 7th Avenue and 125th Street, then broken apart by boys who knew the blocks like the lines on their own palms. One stack went north. One went west toward Lenox. Another went down toward 116th, where the bodegas were already opening their gates and the smell of coffee was already threading through the cold December air. By 7 o'clock the paper was on stoops. By 7:30 it was in barbershops. By 8 it was in every church hall, every beauty parlor, every basement social club from Sugar Hill to East Harlem. And by 8:15 Harlem was reading. The headline did not editorialize. C.B. Powell, the editor of the Amsterdam News, was too smart for that. He knew what editorializing looked like to a man like Thomas Dewey. It looked like opinion. It looked like advocacy. It looked like something a prosecutor could dismiss in a paragraph. So Powell ran the letter as it was written, 3 full pages, uncut, under a headline that stated a simple fact. Harlem woman documents selective prosecution in Dewey Numbers case. No adjectives. No outrage. Just the record. And the record was devastating. The letter named 23 gambling operations investigated by Dewey's office between 1935 and 1937. It cited their case numbers. It cited the dates those cases were opened. It cited the dates those cases were quietly closed. Every one of those 23 operations was white-owned. Every one of them had been investigated, documented, and then set aside without a single indictment, without a single press release, without a single name attached to a headline. The letter did not call this racism. It did not use that word once. It simply laid the facts side by side. 23 white-run operations investigated, 0 prosecuted. 211 black residents of Harlem arrested, charged, or harassed under the same investigation. 211 people who ran numbers to feed their families, who earned $7 a week at jobs that paid nothing, who had built a community lottery system that functioned as a bank for people banks refused to serve. 211 names. 0 indictments of white operators. The letter ended the way Stephanie had written it to end. Not with anger. With precision. These are not allegations. These are matters of public record. Let the public record speak. People read it standing up. In the barbershops on Lenox Avenue, Men who had not planned to stay more than 5 minutes were still there an hour later, passing the paper back and forth, reading passages aloud, circling lines with whatever pen was closest. In the beauty parlor on 131st Street, a woman read the letter out loud to 4 others who had gathered around her chair, and when she finished, nobody spoke for a moment. Then someone said quietly, "She did that?" And everyone in that room knew exactly who she was. On the 9th floor of 60 Center Street, the paper arrived at Thomas Dewey's desk at 8:22 in the morning. His secretary had seen it first, recognized the headline, and brought it in without being asked. Dewey read it twice. The room was quiet. His staff understood that the kind of silence Dewey went into when he was working through a problem was not a silence to interrupt. When he looked up, his expression gave nothing away. He asked for the case files. He asked for the summary of prosecuted white-operated gambling establishments. 2 of his investigators exchanged a look that they hoped he did not see. There was nothing to rebut. That was the problem. Not because the letter was persuasive, though it was, but because every case number it cited was real. Every date was accurate. Every figure was verifiable. You could not call Stephanie St. Clair a liar when she had handed you the receipts. You could not claim bias was absent when your own office's paperwork confirmed the disparity. The letter was not an accusation. It was a mirror. And Dewey's office had no answer for what it showed. A brief meeting was held before noon. No public statement was released. Dewey's team decided that any response would only extend the story. They believed the silence would contain it. They were wrong about that. By noon the wire services had it. The Associated Negro Press moved the story to 41 affiliated outlets before 1 o'clock. By 2 in the afternoon, the phones at the Amsterdam News were ringing with calls from reporters in Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore. By the time the evening editions were being set, the Chicago Defender had written 12 column inches on the story, placing it on the front page under the headline, "Harlem Numbers Queen Exposes Dewey's Double Standard." The Pittsburgh Courier ran a full-column piece the following morning titled "The Letter That Asked the Question New York Would Not." The Baltimore Afro-American ran an editorial that said, in part, that if Thomas Dewey intended to run for governor of the state of New York, the voters of that state deserved to know why his office had spent 18 months arresting black citizens while leaving white-operated gambling houses untouched. The white newspapers in New York handled it differently. The Times ran a brief item on page 12, 18 words, noting that questions had been raised about the scope of Dewey's investigation. The Herald Tribune mentioned it in a roundup of Harlem community news. The Daily News did not run it at all. But the people who needed to read it had already read it. The black press in America in 1937 was not a minor instrument. It was a lifeline. It reached 2 million readers across the country. It reached churches and community halls and barbershops and kitchen tables from Harlem to Atlanta to Los Angeles. When the black press moved a story, it moved. By Thursday evening, 2 city councilmen had called Dewey's office seeking comment. A representative of the NAACP, citing the documented disparity in the letter, sent a formal letter to the district attorney's office requesting an accounting of enforcement decisions in the Harlem investigation. 3 Harlem ministers, whose congregations together included nearly 4,000 people, announced that Sunday sermons would address the question of equal prosecution under law. They did not mention Stephanie by name. They did not have to. The case against Stephanie St. Clair did not disappear that Thursday. Thomas Dewey did not pick up a phone and tell his investigators to stand down. The grand jury did not dissolve overnight. That is not how institutional power works. It does not fold cleanly. It creaks. It slows. It finds reasons to reconsider. It looks at the political cost of proceeding and quietly begins to weigh it against the political cost of stopping. But the frame had shifted. Everything that had been invisible was now visible. Every raid that followed, every subpoena, every motion in that case would be read against the backdrop of a 3-page letter that a 51-year-old black woman from Martinique had written at her desk on Edgecombe Avenue over 4 winter nights. The story Dewey had written, "Crusading Prosecutor Dismantles Illegal Gambling Empire," had been replaced by a different story. And the new story had documentation. Stephanie did not go out that morning. She did not walk down to the corner to see the paper distributed. She did not call anyone. She stayed in the apartment on the 4th floor of 409 Edgecombe Avenue, brewed coffee, and laid 3 copies of the Amsterdam News flat on the dining table. She read the letter as it appeared in print the way a carpenter examines a finished frame, not for admiration but for structural integrity. She checked every line against what she had written. She noted the one paragraph the editor had trimmed, understood why, and agreed with the decision. Then she folded the paper once, set it on the left corner of the desk, and opened the operations ledger. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The letter had done what a letter could do. The rest was up to the people who read it. And the people of Harlem had read it. The grand jury dissolved quietly in the spring of 1938. There was no press conference. No statement from Dewey's office. No formal announcement of any kind. The investigators on the 9th floor of 60 Center Street simply stopped filing new motions. The wiretap logs were closed. The witness lists were filed away. The Harlem Numbers investigation, 18 months of work, 47 men, a secret grand jury, and the full machinery of the state of New York, was concluded without a single conviction tied to Stephanie St. Clair. Prosecutors cited insufficient witness cooperation and conflicting testimony. They did not cite the letter. They did not mention the Amsterdam News. They did not say anything publicly about 23 uninvestigated white-run operations or the disparity that a 51-year-old woman had documented in 3 pages and delivered to a newspaper editor before breakfast on a Thursday morning. They just stopped. And in the language of institutional power, stopping without explanation is as close to an admission as you ever get. Stephanie's name vanished from the case documents. Not crossed out. Not contested. Just gone. As if the investigation had looked at her, considered what it would cost to continue, and decided to look somewhere else. There were costs on the other side too. 6 Harlem residents who had cooperated with Dewey's office, men who had given statements under pressure, who had believed the prosecutor's promises of reduced charges and quiet relocation, were no longer employed by Spring. Some had moved out of the neighborhood. One had gone to relatives in Baltimore. The community has a long memory, and Harlem in 1938 was not a place where betrayal was forgotten quickly or forgiven easily. That is the weight that does not show up in history books. The ones who held the line lost nothing. The ones who broke it lost everything. 3 community leaders who had spoken publicly about Dewey's selective raids during the crisis. A minister from 133rd Street, a block association president from the 140s, and a neighborhood attorney who had given statements to the press, returned to their positions with a new kind of standing. They had told the truth when it was dangerous to tell it. Harlem does not forget that either. Bumpy Johnson came by the apartment on Edgecombe Avenue sometime in late April. He did not stay long. He sat across from Stephanie at the table where the ledgers used to be and said, in his particular way of saying things that were larger than the words he chose, that the city forgets what it learns. He meant it as a warning. He meant it as an observation. He meant it the way a man means something when he has watched power operate long enough to know that it does not correct itself. It simply waits for the moment to pass and then resumes. Stephanie said nothing in response to that. She had heard it before. She had lived it before. She knew he was right. The Amsterdam News ran 2 follow-up pieces through the spring and summer of 1938. The Chicago Defender ran one. The Pittsburgh Courier ran an editorial in June asking, directly and without any diplomatic softening, why Thomas Dewey, who was by then openly positioning himself for a gubernatorial run, had never answered the question the letter raised. Why had 23 white-run gambling operations been investigated and declined? The editorial asked the question. Dewey did not answer it. He was not required to answer it. He ran for governor in 1938 and lost to Herbert Lehman by a narrow margin. Whether the letter contributed to that outcome is a question historians debate. What is not debated is that it was asked and that it was never answered. Stephanie did not give interviews. She did not walk into any newspaper office to accept credit. She did not send follow-up letters. She did not appear at rallies or community forums where her name was spoken with reverence. She had done what needed to be done, and she understood, in the way that people who have survived through intelligence rather than noise understand, that the moment you begin performing a victory, you begin weakening it. The second ledger was destroyed by late spring. She burned it in the kitchen page by page in the early morning when the building was quiet. Its purpose was finished. A weapon you no longer need is a liability you no longer want. Power wielded correctly leaves no fingerprints. It leaves only outcomes. What they could not take from her was the thing they never understood she had. It was not the operations ledger, though that had value. It was not the runners, though they were loyal. It was not even the money, though the money was real. What they could not take from her was the knowledge of how systems work, where they are honest and where they are not, where the record tells the truth and where the record is arranged to conceal it, and how to use the tools of a system against the people who believe that system only works for them. Stephanie St. Clair came to this country from Martinique with $200 and a capacity for observation that was sharper than anything the state of New York could assemble in 18 months. She built a community. She protected it. And when the most powerful prosecutor in New York came for her with 47 investigators and the weight of the law, she sat at her desk, uncapped her pen and reminded all of them, that information precisely deployed, is the most dangerous thing in any room. He had 47 investigators. She had a pen. He should have known which was more dangerous.